on the cloud as we do. Welcome to Wednesday, everybody. What day is today? April 28th. The Wednesday today is featuring Robert, who is representing a winery called Klet Brda out of Slovenia. They do quite a few wines the co-op carries. We've got the Avia in our glasses tonight, a Pinot Grigio and a Cabernet Sauvignon. And we've got a orange wine called Krasno, which is a blend of Rebula, Malvasia and Sauvignon, which is not Sauvignon Blanc, but Robert here is going to explain all of the cool, fun stuff about these wines. He's actually Asheville based, which is really cool that we've got somebody so close to us that can tell us about, wine half a world away.
Right.
So Robert, I'll let you take it away, and we can talk about what makes this winery so cool.
Great. Thanks so much again for having me. So my name is Robert. I am lucky enough that I have been selling and talking about Slovenian wine for about 20 years now, which sounds unusual because we still kind of talk about Slovenia as an emerging region. When it's been emerging for a while, I think it's safe to say that it has emerged. But a little more background on myself. I'm originally from the Northeast. I used to work for a fairly famous Italian restaurant owner, the Bastianich family, who, while not from Slovenia, are from the region directly south. There's a little town called Trieste, and much like Slovenia, this whole region borders have changed so many times over the past few hundred years that you kind of pick a spot on the timeline, and it's almost like throwing a dart at the dartboard to see what country this little town or this little region belongs to. So when I was working there, we had a lot of Italian wines, but also because of where the family was from, and this is early 2000s, we had a lot of Slovenian wines because where these wines come from and where Klet Brda, the winery, is literally kilometers from the Italian border. And it's one of those regions where our actual wine growing region in Slovenia is known as Brda. In Italy is known as Collio. They're the exact same region. There is no difference in terms of the soils. Everyone, almost without exception, speaks both Italian and Slovenian. They probably speak a little bit of Croatian as well, because Croatia is just south of us. The soils are the same. The weather's the same. It's not even like there's a river or a huge mountain range that divides the two countries. It's a national border that is basically the result of 2 world wars and a civil war after the breakup of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. But now with Slovenia having been part of the EU since 2004, there's no border crossing to speak of. It's just a sign, you're in Slovenia or you're in Italy. So these regions have really been intertwined for literally hundreds of years. And depending on what time in history you're talking about, Slovenia proper, the country itself, was either independent, under control of the Austrian Empire, under control of the Habsburgs, under control of Italy. So like I said, pick a spot on the timeline and you can kind of just roll the dice to make a guess as to who was controlling this region. So it really is at the confluence of several major parts of Europe. So there is, and especially where we are, there's a Mediterranean angle. We do have a very, very small coastline on the Adriatic Sea. If you go north, it becomes much more Central European, much more Mitteleuropa, much more Austrian in nature. If you go further east, we share a border with Croatia and Hungary, and it becomes much more of what you would typically think of as Eastern European. And the culture, cuisine, language reflects all of that. So it's always been a really interesting region in that you've got this sort of epicenter where all these different worlds, the Balkan Peninsula, the Mediterranean, Middle Europe, Eastern Europe, are all kind of meeting together. Now, after the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia broke up in 1991 thereabouts, There was obviously a pretty brutal civil war with the other constituent republics. Slovenia did not have any war to speak of. There were a few small border skirmishes, but really that was it. Slovenia was the first republic to declare independence and really had always been the most sort of Western-looking country of the constituent republics in Yugoslavia. They were the most economically successful. They've got one of the oldest universities that was in the country in Ljubljana, the capital. So really at that time, we're poised to really almost immediately join what we thought of as Europe proper and kind of, come into the dawning of a new era. Now, Klet Brda is a winery that's been in existence since the days of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So we've been around since 1957, and we're very successful through the days of Yugoslav Republic and are very successful today. And the model that we work on is something that's very common in Europe for wineries. It's not really something we deal with wineries in the US, and that's the notion of a cooperative farm. So you do see this a lot, especially in the dairy industry in the US, but for wines, it's something that's kind of foreign to us as Americans. So what is a cooperative winery? So the easiest way I can explain it is we control about 1,000 hectares. So that's going to be about 2,500 acres in American units. But we have only 400 member growers. So we have 400 different farmers controlling 1,000 hectares, which means that the average landholding of each of those farmers is only going to be about 2.5 hectares. So it doesn't make a lot of sense for every one of those 400 farmers with only about 2.5 hectares that they farm to each have their own bonded winery with a press, space for aging, pressing equipment, bottling equipment, all the capital equipment and the space and the winemaking know-how that's needed. It just wouldn't make sense. So you would have 400 different farmers that each make 1 or 2 barrels of wine a year. How do you market it? How do you sell it? So the cooperative is, I'm sorry, go ahead, Zach.
At the co-op, we have a few other cooperatively grown wines. Right. It's very big in Italy, which obviously makes sense. Right there, we have some stuff from Argentina. And then, as you were saying, we do a little bit of French cooperatively grown. And like you were saying, I think it makes perfect sense where why should, 400 people have the same equipment and make okay wine? I'm sure there'll be some stellar, I'm sure there'll be some really bad ones. It reminds me, I was in Croatia several years ago and Malvasia there, if it was just made by a guy on the side of the road, was probably not very good because he makes his money, he drinks through the winter and then does it over again versus, pouring in a lot of skill, which as affordable as the Avia line is, I think it really shows. Not to segue a little into some wine, if everybody wants to try the Avia Pinot Grigio. And Robert, you can please feel free to continue. Just want to make sure everybody was, having a nice little sip.
Ready to drink, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it's really, it offers us an economy of scale. And that's all that it does. And like I said, it's very common in Europe. And we avoid the kind of situation that we have in North Carolina where there's a brewery on every block, sometimes several on every block. So this way, as opposed to tripping over wineries, we've kind of centralized all our efforts. So we have one large building where we can do the bottling and pressing and aging. We can all lean on each other in terms of farming know-how, equipment, how to manage if there's a problem in the vineyards with pests or with bad weather. How do we pool our resources together? And it is, I think in these, somewhat chaotic times, I think a story of people that can still get together and work for a common cause and work together for a common good is something to be commended and something to maybe model ourselves on to some extent. But in those 1,000 hectares, we grow a lot of different grapes. One of the, not the number one, but probably the number 2 in terms of acreage is Pinot Grigio. And I'll get to the number one when we get to the orange wine. But Pinot Grigio is very common in the area. It does very well in our area. We have weather-wise sort of a combination of Mediterranean and Alpine weather. So not as hot as the more Mediterranean areas as you get closer to Italy proper, but again, not as cold and not as wet as you get further north towards Austria. And this year's an especially good illustration of how kind of favorably we are positioned. If you read any sort of typical wine news, there was a really, really bad frost through a lot of parts of Europe this spring. So a lot of French vineyards have really gotten devastated because their vines are already beginning to bud. So if you get a hard freeze when your vines are budding, you may lose a large part, if not your entire crop for that year.
Yeah, that's Loire and Burgundy right now are.
Yeah, it's been bad. So because we are a little bit cooler, yeah, it did freeze by us, but our vines haven't started budding yet. We're budding a little bit later, so we actually beat that hard frost. If we get another one, then we could have a problem. But as it stands now, we do look to be in pretty good shape. But again, because of where we are and being based kind of at, sort of the crossroads of Europe, we have always had a lot of what we typically think of as French and Italian grapes planted in our vineyards. So we've had Pinot Grigio in vineyards in the Brda region since 1850. And this was a period of kind of French and Austrian dominance of the region. This was during, when the Habsburgs kind of reigned supreme throughout Europe. These were families that wanted to drink wines that they were familiar with. So we saw a lot of things like Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon being brought and being planted into the region. So there's quite a long history of these grapes in the region. It's not something that was just planted, in the 90s. It wasn't something that we did after, Slovenian independence. So it's something that we have a really, really long history of. And Pinot Grigio especially is a grape that kind of favors a little bit of a cooler kind of environment, because you preserve some of that crispness, you preserve some of that freshness. If you've ever had, a Pinot Gris from California, they tend to be a lot fatter, can have almost like an oily texture, because the grapes are getting so much riper, you're getting a lot more sugar. Where we are, it's much more sort of straightforward citrus flavors, and a little more, I think, a little more explosive in terms of the aromatics. I do get some really good kind of peach and almost floral flavors. And the other thing I should mention that is very unique about what we do, especially at the price point we're looking at with the Avia wines. All of our wines are hand harvested, which is literally unheard of at these prices, and also dry farmed, meaning we don't use any artificial irrigation. And people ask me, well, what's the significance of dry farming? Most vines that are grown in the New World are all irrigated. So what does that mean? What is the qualitative difference? Now, you can still make, very, very good wines from irrigated vines, but because the history of winemaking in Europe, in the Old World, goes back so much longer, we have already found the favorable regions where you can plant vines and not need to irrigate. So you've kind of naturally selected 4 vineyard areas that are really best suited for vines, and that they're not overly wet and they're not overly dry. So you don't need to go in and add the man-made effect of, artificially, upping or decreasing the water levels of where you're planting. So between the hand harvesting and the dry farming, it's just something that you don't see at the kind of prices that we're able to sell the wines at. And, the low price, sometimes may scare people away. They think, oh, how could this wine be any good? And, oh, it's from Eastern Europe. As I talked about Slovenia as an emerging, if not emerged region, I feel we've definitely emerged. We've been doing this for quite some time. But it's like anything else. Name recognition means a lot. So think about, when you're shopping for real estate, the house in the hot neighborhood is always going to be more expensive than the kind of lesser known neighborhood that's maybe, doesn't, is on, the wrong side of this hill and doesn't get enough sun or whatever. The emerging neighborhood is never going to be as expensive. So simply, despite my best efforts, not everyone has heard of Slovenian wine yet. I'm slowly trying to change that, one person at a time. So the pricing is simply what the market will bear. We want to introduce people to what we do and get them to just try it and not be afraid of, oh, this is from a country that I'm maybe less familiar with. And I think the Pinot Grigio is a great spring, summer, everyday drinker.
Sure. And I think also using, like you were saying, like the international varietals gives somebody that kind of safety net that they might not necessarily have with a native varietal, or if you put Malvasia on a bottle.
Right.
I would even be hesitant, and I like Malvasia. So like, there's still obviously some education, which is why we're doing wine days. And the cool thing, at the co-op we carry Cabernet, Pinot Noir, Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio, and sometimes Riesling and Sauvignon Blanc. The Avia just came out with a new can. So this is what's in my glass tonight. And so convenient 250 ml can, 4-pack liter. So it's a 8-ounce can or so, which is about a third of a bottle. So me and Abby split this can, and it's an easy kind of intro glass into the evening without being necessarily a little heavier as the night goes on. And also convenient, like you can take this camping, you can take it to the park, you can no glass to worry about, obviously little pop top. It's a really convenient, and also just another way to add some accessibility to very easygoing kind of picnic wine, which I think this does. Really,
and that's exactly how I think of it. It is picnic wine. If you're doing something outside, especially if you're going to be out by a pool or something, and you don't necessarily want to have glass bottles around. If you're going to be in bare feet, if you're going to be by a tennis court or somewhere, it's just super convenient. And I kind of like the idea with the Pinot Grigio of having the mama bear, papa bear, and baby bear sizes. So we've got 250 milliliters, 750 milliliters, and 1500. So a size for any and all occasions.
Yeah, about that seems to be a more robust Pinot Grigio than your common Italian Pinot Grigios.
Yeah.
So why is that?
The major thing I'll tell you is our yields in the vineyard being less than what you would find in the equivalent Italian Pinot Grigio. And again, that comes down to what the market will bear at any particular price point. So our Pinot Grigio is probably going to crop out at about 6, maybe 7 tons an acre, which is not super low, but there are, your typical kind of grocery store Italian Pinot Grigio is going to be well over 10. Now, what does that mean? And for folks that aren't familiar with grape farming or with really fruit farming in general, when you're talking about farming grains, you want as much yield. If you're farming wheat or soybeans, you want as much yield as possible per acre. Because the nature of this part of the plant is different than, fruiting plants. With fruiting plants, you actually want less yield per acre. So you're going to get higher quality in a smaller amount of fruit. Plants are strange things in that they can't move on their own. So when a plant is happy, all the plant is going to do is create vegetation. And if it's going to create a lot of fruit, that fruit is just going to be filled with mostly water. And that's where you get those kind of thin, overly acidic, kind of characterless, and almost colorless, kind of really, really cheap Pinot Grigios. Now, if you're getting your vines in an area where the plants are what we call stressed, and it literally means like the plant's kind of stressed. It's not super happy where it is. Since a plant can't just get up and move and say, I don't like this neighborhood, I'm going to move to a different neighborhood. The only way a plant can move is to reproduce. And fruiting plants will reproduce by producing fruit. The higher quality fruit that it produces, the greater a chance that a bird or an animal is going to come and consume that fruit and then hopefully deposit the seeds someplace else. Now, what does that all mean? You're concentrating the plant's energy into a smaller possible space. So if you're only getting, say, 4 clusters per vine as opposed to 8 clusters or 12 clusters, you're getting that same amount of energy that would have went into 12 clusters into only 4 clusters. And that's not just going to mean sugar levels. Sugar levels don't necessarily mean quality wine. A lot of it has to do with the other compounds that are found in grapes, in grape skins, especially as we'll see with the orange wine, the things that really offer full flavor development. And the easiest way that you'll really see this difference in quality is on the nose of the wine. And to me, you know, the first mark of, you know, you're tasting or smelling a wine, the first thing I really look for is how strong does this wine smell? And to me, most importantly, how many different things can I smell? You know, to me, the mark of a quality wine is complexity. Am I getting just fruit? Or am I starting to get some mineral elements? Am I getting maybe some floral or vegetal elements? You know, give me more things per glass, and that's what's going to keep me happiest.
Sure. And I think also that also relates to the non-irrigating way of dry farming of growing, because by letting plants, you know, have all the water that they want, will produce. You know, that's the whole point of being a plant, is to grow more, you know, fruits, which equals more seeds, which equals you know, more, like, you know, viability of reproduction. You know, that's the whole idea with growing a plant. So if you can, like, as Robert was saying, like, really stress and make the grapes kind of struggle, kind of search for that water, make sure their roots get even further to find the water table, then, you know, the fruit they're going to produce is going to be the very best that plant can produce. So that way, hopefully, with, you know, the right winemaking skill, we have even better wine. You know, you've heard of old vine winery or, you know, vineyards before. That's the same kind of thing, because these vines are, like, you know, kind of tired, if you will. So they've been producing fruit for 50 years or 100 years. So they aren't producing the same amount of yield that a, you know, sprightly young vine would do, but the quality and the kind of density, if you will, of the grapes that they're producing are quite a bit higher. You know, dry farming, we also have like some flood farming, where they'll flood the field once, and that's all the water that the grapes get. It's South American typically. So it's really, you know, grapes, and we talk about this every time, but grapes are a product of both, you know, the farming and the, you know, the stewardship that goes into the land, as well as the climate. This is what, roughly 20 kilometers, 50 kilometers above Alto Adige. Is that right?
We're about, so our average, I'd say our average vineyard is about 200 meters above sea level. And in terms of where we are in relation to Italy, you know, there are vineyards that are, you know, 0 kilometers from the Italian border, with some old vineyards that are actually, they have an owner that owns land on both sides of the border within a single vineyard. You can actually look on Google Maps and Google Earth, and you can see the national border basically just cutting across vineyards. Like I said, there's not like, oh, here's a big river and okay, this is Italy, this is Slovenia, or there's a big mountain and we're on this side, they're on that side. It's like, I'm here and I'm there. It's like that part where you can, in the US, where you can stand in Utah and Colorado and somewhere else all at the same time. It's much like that.
You have to actually drive on Native American property to get to Four Corners. And then you have to, you know, like, queue in line so that everybody take their picture in the middle and then do it all over again. But
and it's funny that you mentioned that. So there are actually some vineyards where you can't reach the particular side of the vineyard without crossing the national border and back, because it's a very hilly region. Sorry, my dog is.
Okay.
Hang on one second.
That's working at home.
Exactly. We love the snafus. But so Ed and Lynn, what do you guys think of the Pinot Grigio?
Well, yeah, I was going to say that we really can taste the difference with wines that are made from stressed grapes.
Mhm.
We had at one point we kind of gave up on Pinot Grigio because it
Right.
just tasted like water.
Yep.
There wasn't much body to it, and so it's good to have this explanation. And we are really enjoying both the Pinot Grigio and the orange wine.
Good.
So it's
Great.
good to have the reason that it's better.
Yeah. And actually, I think that's a great time, Robert, if you want to take us into the Krasno. We
Yeah.
can talk
So
what makes this, beautiful amber color and how it's different from our white wine.
So orange wine is something that everyone, we're hearing more and more about it these days. Orange wine is really a very old way of making wine, really the original way of making what we would today call white wine. So typically when you're making, say, a white wine like Pinot Grigio, you bring those grapes into the winery. You put them in what is today a very, very gentle, often computer-controlled press that's basically like a giant bladder in a giant metal tube. Very, very gently presses the grapes, lets the juice run out. When the juice runs out, it's almost immediately clear right from the get-go. So you're getting almost no solid matter and nothing from the skins themselves into the wine. Go back 100, 200, several hundred, the 10,000 years of the history of winemaking. When you're making white, what we call white wine, making wine from white grapes, you would make it the exact same way that you would make wine from red grapes. You're going to crush the grapes. The juice is going to be all mixed in with the mashed up pieces of fruit, the mashed up skins, the seeds, the stems, what have you. And it really wasn't until probably about early 1800s in France that the notion of white versus red wines really became a clear difference. And the methodology between making the two really became something different. So when you're making red wines, it's important to note, you take the darkest of red grapes in the world. Take something like Syrah or Cabernet Sauvignon. When you crush that grape, the juice that runs out of it is almost completely clear. There's almost no pigmentation in the juice of wine grapes themselves. Where you're getting that pigmentation is you're crushing the grapes and letting it sit with the crushed up skins and stems and all the elements that have all those really deep pigmentation compounds. So we've become familiar with what red wine offers us, the color and also the texture, and the main textural component being tannin. So tannin is that sort of drying effect when you drink a red wine. So you drink a hearty red wine, you can run your tongue along the roof of your mouth and it feels like it grips. Black tea will have the same effect. If you drink strong, like English black tea, you'll feel that same effect of the tannin. So for these past, 200 years, and especially in the last 100 years, we have sort of forgotten that white grapes have all of this to offer us as well. Now think about, eating fruit with the skin on versus peeled. A fruit that I think is a great example of this is if you think of like a Bosc pear, those are the pears with the really kind of leathery, kind of tough skin on them. Now, you can peel them or you can eat them with the skin on, and it's a very different experience, and they're both really pleasurable. What I personally like is when you bite into that pear with the skin on, you've got that little bit of contrast with the bitterness and the leatheriness and the tannin component of the skin. It almost makes the fruit seem sweeter. It almost accentuates how kind of lush and soft and sweet and aromatic the fruit portion is, because you've got, to kind of fight through the bitterness and the leatheriness of the skin. It's almost like the fruit is making you work harder for its rewards. Now, orange wine, as we understand it. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ed.
What a great description. Thank you.
Oh,
We really appreciate your background information. That's so helpful.
I'm happy because I know these are complicated topics sometimes. So I try and break them down with analogies that I haven't strained too much. So I appreciate the vote of confidence.
Really appreciate it.
Great. So orange wine, as we know it today, the trend, if you want to call it that, funnily enough, started in the Brda and Collio region. So right here on the border of Italy and Slovenia, a couple of very enterprising winemakers, really in about the mid 1990s, couple of guys that were, sort of friends with each other on both sides of the border again. So some in Slovenia proper, some in Italy, started reading some older, sometimes ancient winemaking texts. And one of them just got the idea that, why don't I try doing this the way that they used to do it 100 years ago? And maybe I'll try doing it the way they did it 200 years ago or 500 years ago. And there was this little group that started making white wines that's called macerated, so soaked on the skins, the same way the wines would have been made in many hundreds of years ago. And, it kind of, the saying overnight sensation after 25 years, this is a great example of it. So back in, as I said, when I was selling Slovenian wine in 2002, orange wines had become a thing on wine lists. They weren't a popular thing. They were also an extremely expensive thing. And I would often sell them to people, and people would say, you need to take this bottle off my table. This is disgusting. What are you serving me? What is wrong with you? This wine is spoiled. I said, no. It's supposed to be like that, which is, like you buy a used car and it's making all this noise, and the guy say, no, it's supposed to do that. So they were a tough sell 20 years ago. But as things sort of progressed and the winemaking behind these wines became a little more finessed, and I think really embraced that idea of how do we get the other elements that have been missing from white wines, and then kind of along the way discovering how much is too much. So you had folks that were soaking wine on the skins for a year. And the wines were not good. They were, there's orange wine and then there's brown wine that tastes like, spoiled Snapple iced tea. A lot of us, we've pulled back from the brink. And now what we do with the orange wine, the Krasno, is, I think, somewhat typical to what you'd see in this style nowadays. So there's a lot to talk about with the Krasno wine. So feel free to stop me or ask any additional questions. So, as I mentioned, we do control about 1,000 hectares in Slovenia. Krasno is one single village. It's what we call a municipality. So there's a couple of farmhouses and, a church and maybe, like a postal office. And a gas station. So it's not a town or a village per se. There's not much there except for this collection of hilltop vineyards. These are higher elevation vineyards for us. So here we're getting between 300 and 400 meters above sea level. The soils have even more chalk-like material in them. And chalk soils are among the best types of soils to grow vines on. You tend to get great flavor development, and most importantly, help preserve the acidity in wine, so you can harvest later but still have a nice bright freshness to the wines. And here's where things get. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ed.
Can I interrupt? Yeah.
Sure.
2 questions on the orange wine.
Yeah.
If you went back 200 years ago, would that, for a historical perspective, would that have been the common wine?
It would have been, this actually would have been fairly representative of wines made in this region. Maybe not as orange and maybe not as finessed, might have been darker, might have been lighter. But one of the next point I was going to get to is this wine is what's called a field blend. And you see this all over Europe and you see it in the US too. But the original kind of meaning and purpose behind a field blend was, rather than today where you go see a modern vineyard where things are all very manicured and you have 1 acre of this grape and then you have 2 acres of this grape and you know exactly what is in each and every row and what's going on with every plant. You go to a vineyard 100 years ago, some places even 50 years ago, some places even today. You talk to the farmer and he says, I think that vine is something and that other one is something else. And I think those over there are such and such. And it's just a blend that is made in the vineyard. And what you would have is you kind of pick a time to harvest. You harvest everything at once because you've got all these different grape varieties that ripen at different levels and at different rates. You hope that you kind of hit, the Goldilocks angle where at least one of them is at optimum ripeness. Some of the other varieties, maybe they're a little too ripe. Maybe the sugar levels are a little bit higher than you'd want. And then maybe some others you're harvesting a little bit earlier. There's going to be less sugar, less flavor development, but you're going to get a lot of nice acidity from those grapes. So by sort of doing things in a crude way, you're actually doing things in a very smart way because you've got this self-correcting system where you have all these different varieties that can then work in harmony to create a cohesive whole, whereas each of those grapes on their own might not be, any great shakes. Now, today, we do harvest all of these 3 grapes separately. We know exactly what is in each vineyard and, very, very meticulous in terms of the farming. But this method of the field blend is something that's very old, and it's something that we've now kind of adapted to modern winemaking techniques and modern vineyard technology. Now, what's to me,
the price point of this one is somewhat higher. Just looking at my invoice from the co-op market, so that is more of a processing.
Exactly. So it's more involved in terms of the process. The yield is going to be much, much lower in these vineyards. So some of these we might be down to just 1 ton per acre. So again, you're getting even more concentration, higher quality grapes. And these are also, even like I said, all of our grapes, regardless of where they're farmed, are hand harvested. There's easy hand harvesting and then there's tough hand harvesting. Because of the steepness of these vineyards and how kind of curved they are, this is tough hand harvesting. This is hard work. And this wine also spends more time in the winery. So we've got 3 different grapes here, 2 of which are absolutely native to Slovenia. One which for a long time we thought was native to Slovenia, but turns out, again, it's another import from France that they imported from France, and France actually forgot that it was something that they had. So in order of importance, kind of going down, the hit list here is the number 1 grape that we grow in Slovenia, which is called Rebula, Rebula. You may have seen it known as Rebula Gialla in Italy. Exact same grape. It's a grape that has been attested in the region since about the 1300s. So one of the nice things about Slovenian history is there is a fairly long history of Austrian monks and abbeys being in the region, and monks and abbeys and the Catholic Church being incredibly involved in wine growing and also keeping meticulous records, have records of all these old varieties. So it's nice to have this kind of history available to us. So Rebula is actually the number 1 grape grown in Slovenia. The grape on its own is in a sense very, very Chardonnay-like in terms of its flavor profile and in terms of what it does. I get from Rebula when it's by itself, less so much apple and more kind of pear flavors. The flavors are a little bit deeper. It also tends to be a little bit more high acid than Chardonnay, so a little kind of crunchier, a little more structured. And most importantly, it's a grape that, and I compare it to pear for a reason, you actually get a lot of really nice flavor from the skins of Rebula. And it's become one of the more common grapes to employ the skin contact method with, because you actually, it's something where you are actually adding to the wine. Some wine grapes, some white grapes, you know, not every fruit out there you want to eat with the skin on. So think, you know, watermelon rind is maybe not as pleasant as the skin on an apple or a pear. And there are some white grapes where the skin contact doesn't really add anything to it. I found Sauvignon Blanc can be one of those. Sometimes it works, sometimes it just makes the wine taste a little odd. But Rebula is a grape that really lends itself well to this process. So these grapes, the Rebula grapes, will spend about a month soaking on the skins, and then about another year in used oak barrels to age and to mellow out, and then we'll blend with the other two grapes. Now,
What a beautiful color. We can't wait to present this to us.
Yeah.
Now, so the next grape of importance, I'm sorry?
I do have one question.
Sure.
When you say they're aged in oak barrels,
Right.
that oak come from the United States, as we have heard in previous wine stays?
No, so this is oak that is actually from France. So the oak, yeah, so the oak that you find in Europe, there's a major species with some subspecies, depending where in Europe it's grown, tends to be have a tighter grain structure. It doesn't impart as oaky a flavor. A little more sort of, you get the vanilla, but there's a little more subtle spice, a little bit of almost like a cinnamon and clove kind of component to European or French oak.
Yeah, the classic
Right.
that you when you pick it versus like we tried in the Rioja last week or 2 weeks ago, which is like that a more almost abrasive, but in a really good way for like coconut, dill pickle, vanilla, like really big, bold flavors. And so this is French, like you said. There's also Slavonian, there's Hungarian, there's a whole bunch, and it's all different grain patterns. And you know, you can kind of think of American, like really wide and spread. French, like really tight. So there's almost like less surface area for the wine to kind of soak into versus, you know, where if it was a wider pattern, like in the Rioja, it kind of soaks in there a little more.
Yeah, American oak a little bit goes a long way because of that kind of wide open grain structure.
What a difference that makes.
I think have we lost you?
Nope.
Okay. No, we just wondered because that's what we had heard about the American oak for wine barrels. And so that's a good explanation.
Yeah, and it's a great question because, and it's one that I get fairly often, and it's tough, you know, to taste oak. I think the best way to learn how to taste oak in wines is to taste the wine that has no oak right next to it, and this way you have the contrast of the two next to each other, and then you can really kind of suss out the differences. If you're just tasting a wine that has a lot of oak on it, it's very easy to get lost in that oak and to learn, okay, what exactly am I looking for here? You lose the forest for the trees, so to speak, for a very, very poor pun on my part. That was completely unintentional, but that's where my mind led me. So the second grape in the orange wine is a grape called Malvasia. Malvasia is a funny grape because you will see a lot of different grapes called Malvasia. Malvasia as a grape is kind of a generic name. There is no Malvasia family, even though you look in a wine textbook, you will see 40 different wines called Malvasia, generally appended with where it's from. In our case, it's a vine called Malvasia istarska, So the Malvasia of the Istrian Peninsula, close to where we are, unrelated to any other Malvasia that you'll see. And every other Malvasia is unrelated to any other Malvasia. It's just kind of a generic name that was given to wine grapes that tended to produce high sugar levels and were kind of easy to grow. But it's one of those things that makes learning about wine difficult, is sometimes you have these names and you never know what's similar, what's different, what's related, what's not related. So, you know, the Europeans like to make things tough on us sometimes. So I'm here to help everyone kind of sort through the confusion as best as possible. Now, Malvasia Estarska, flavor-wise, can give you some really, really rich flavors. A fig, most notable if you taste it on its own, and even a little bit of almost like a honey kind of element. And don't think necessarily in terms of the sweetness of honey. The best examples will give you almost like if you've ever had chestnut honey, which can have a very bitter component to it, but it reminds me of chestnut honey. And then last but not least, another one of really our most important grapes in Slovenia and in northeastern Italy, a grape that used to be called Tokaj Friulano, that is unrelated to the Tokaj of Hungary, that in 2004, with a bunch of new countries joining the European Union, Hungary said to the EU Agricultural Board, you have to get everyone, all these people, to stop using the name Tokaj for a grape that's unrelated to the wine that we make. So to make things more confusing, Italy and Slovenia, the two countries that use the Tokaj Friulano grape, decided, okay, we won't use Tokaj Friulano, but now we're both going to use two different names for the same grape. So in Italy, they now just call it Friulano. And in Slovenia, we've opted for the old French name, which is Sauvignonasse, which literally means Sauvignon-like. And for a long time, it was thought that this was somehow a locally born variant of the Sauvignon Blanc grape. Turns out it's not local. It is actually from France. It's from the sort of area just southwest of Bordeaux. You used to find it in some old white blends, maybe 100, maybe 50 years ago. If you went there in France, you might find one or two farmers that farm it, let alone have heard of it. But it's a major part of what's grown in Slovenia and in northeastern Italy in Friuli. Skin contact, this is another grape that's very common for it. But really what you want Sauvignonasse / Tokaj Friulano / Friulano for are the aromatics. You get really, really just sort of pungent, almost tropical, very floral, very explosive aromatics, but in a bone dry wine, and a wine that's cohesive and that makes sense. A lot of grapes that have really explosive aromatics can be kind of awkward when you actually taste them. I don't know anyone that doesn't like the smell of Gewürztraminer. I know very few people that actually enjoy drinking Gewürztraminer. It's something like, you know, you want to dab it on as perfume or cologne, but when it comes time to drinking it, the texture is just often wrong. It's, you know, it's either too sweet or not sweet enough. And you can probably tell Gewürztraminer is one of my least favorite grapes. So I like to make fun of it whenever I can. But Sauvignonasse, kind of, it's got the whole package. So it's got those really exotic, aromatic, floral, tropical. There's almost like an almond, almost like a marzipan kind of sweetness to it, which is just really great. And just kind of rounds out the whole package. So with all of these grapes, again, spending separately about a month on the skins for each one, and then finally blended, we've got, you know, just a hint of color. You know, these are soaked at cooler temperatures. So you're able to control the amount of extraction, both in terms of the color and the textural component, the tannin. Think about when you're making tea, if you put a tea bag into a cold glass of water, you'll get very, very little extraction. You'll get a little bit of color, you'll get a little bit of flavor. If you put it in very hot water, you'll get very dark color, you'll get a lot of flavor and a lot of tannin. Wine's the same way, red or white or orange or rosé. The warmer you let that maceration happen, the more extraction you're going to get. So here we're keeping the temperature at around just under 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So, you know, cool enough to the touch, you know, just a little bit of warmth to it to get just enough extraction. Whereas the red, so we can move on to the Cabernet Sauvignon now. The Cabernet Sauvignon, we're going to ferment and soak this at closer to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, because you're going to get, you know, you've got these great, stupendous, really strong red grapes in Cabernet Sauvignon. You want to get all the flavor and all the color and all the great things that come from the skins and the seeds and the stems out of that wine. And with the Cabernet, so now we're back to the Avia brand. The thing that I love about the Avia Cabernet, and again, a lot of this comes down to price point. If you've tasted, say, something that's Cabernet Sauvignon from California at this price point, it's going to taste much different than this. And there's no two ways about it. It's going to be grown in a much warmer climate. You're going to get very, very high sugar levels. And what you get when you grow red grapes like Cabernet Sauvignon in an area that's too hot, you get tremendous production of sugar in the grapes, but you're not going to get tremendous development of all the other compounds that are actually going to provide flavor and kind of wrap that fruit in a nice bow. So you'll get, you know, when you taste really, really cheap Cabernet Sauvignon from California, the wines will often taste oddly sweet and green at the same time. So it's almost like, you know, you're eating underripe fruit that just has a lot of sugar artificially added to it. And it hasn't been artificially added into those wines. It's just they're grown in an area like, you know, the Central Coast, the Central Valley of California, where you've got this baking heat. The grapes have no time to rest. All they can do, all they're able to produce is sugar content. And you just don't get the same kind of complexity. So you'll get a big wine that has a big sweet flavor, but it's like a movie where the story doesn't go anywhere. What I love about the... Go ahead, Ed.
I interrupt that. Is that how, because there was always the game in California is to make really big cabs. Is that where you're going with that?
Not necessarily. So I'm talking about the stuff that sees really, really huge production levels and is trying to hit a lower price point. What you find in the sort of super premium realm of Napa Cabernet, you'll notice a lot of those wineries will talk about how these are hillside vineyards. They'll talk about the elevation. Elevation and hillsides are the things that can mitigate the extreme heat that you'll get during the day. So you'll get, you know, there are parts in Napa Valley that will be triple digits during the day and might get down to the 60s, if not the 50s at night. What that's going to do is that's going to allow the other elements in the grape that need to develop to provide a really full, complex, and complete flavor. It'll allow those compounds to kind of catch up to the sugar levels.
So that's what we're talking about right now is what's called the diurnal shift, which we've touched about before. So it's how it's the change of temperature from the hot, you know, the very top temperature of the day to the very low temperature of the day. Napa is great for that. Washington State is great for that, where you're basically in a desert because of the lack of rainfall. And then there's these things called rain shadows, which I think we've touched on before, where it's the shadow that the mountains cast that prevent or encourage rainfall. The fact that it's on a hillside lets the water kind of run off, where the low valleys, where like Central Valley, it basically catches. So the grapes can do exactly what they want, which is produce a bunch of sugar. And then you are converting that into 14.5% juice, basically, which I have. And if you want that, that's great. The co-op is more than happy to provide really big, full, like juicy Cabernet. However, what's in our glass tonight has had to struggle some, and you can taste that with, there's the green note that Robert was mentioning is pyrazine. So it's that kind of, you know, take a bell pepper and crack it in half and smell, and that like really green, like note that is present in some Cabernets. I find it to be in Cab Franc and Carmenere, which can be a really good thing. But in general for Cab, like like what I was talking about earlier, the typicity that this cab offers reminds me of more Bordeaux style versus
Exactly.
New World California. And for $8, like you're getting really killer glass of wine because it has those red fruit flavors without being super dense and overpowering, which you can find in, you know, those like $2 Chuck or, you know, the other mass produced. I mean, the fact that this was hand harvested and you're comparing to wines that, and your price point wise, that are gathered by huge machines, you know, no sorting is done. It's just crushed and turned into wine in, you know, 45 days. It's acidified or chapitalized, which is a sugar balancing technique, and then slammed into a bottle, and then it's on the shelf. You know, these folks are really putting a lot of effort into making a wine, and it's really, really cool. And I mean, Robert, you've been a very great wealth of knowledge tonight. And if you were to add a few things to the Cabernet, and Ed and Lynn, if you have any other questions, we're just about to wrap up this awesome Slovenian edition of Wines.
So I would like to make a kind of a tangential comment.
Sure.
Which does not have to do with the wine per se, but I come from a French background.
Okay.
I'm so glad to hear you saying Sauvignon as opposed to Savignon. Everybody here in the United States says Savignon, and that's not right. It's Sauvignon.
I am lucky that I come from a restaurant background, and I have worked for, and I'm also of an age where there were still folks like this in the restaurant business. I have worked with enough sadistic French maitre d's and chefs that would, you know, throw a pot at your head if you mispronounce something in French. My French pronunciation isn't great, but at least I always operate under the fear of being, you know, bonked on the back of the head by, you know, some guy named Michel.
Yeah, right. Okay.
The French can be obnoxious, that's true.
Well, I don't blame them.
They're a unique people, and what's most interesting about France, people forget that it's a big country, and much like the U.S., there are extreme differences from one region to the next. So if you go in Bordeaux, it is much more kind of buttoned down. If I was talking to some of my old work partners in Bordeaux, I would have a tie and a suit on, even though it's 80 degrees here. Whereas if you talk to folks in Burgundy, you know, jeans and t-shirt might be too formal for some of them. And my friends that are in south of France, they look like the Guidos that I grew up with in Queens. They're wearing tracksuits and they got the gold chains with the giant cross on it. And they want to play bocce and pétanque and smoke cigarettes. So France is like a lot of different countries in one.
But what about pronunciation? Do they all say Sauvignon? Am I wrong?
No, in France they all say Sauvignon. That's my best approximation of French pronunciation right now. But you're right. Sauvignon is what I hear a lot in the States. I have opted in most instances to, you know, go along to get along. I try not to correct people's pronunciation unless I literally cannot understand them. But it's also important, you know, in France, the pronunciation is fairly regular. But I've been to other countries in Italy and Spain and Croatia and Slovenia where there is a lot more dialectical variation between, you know, they will call grapes different names, you know, 10 kilometers down the road. So like I said, go along to get along. If I'm in some vineyard somewhere and they say, well, we call it this, I say, all right, I'm not gonna tell you what to call it because this is your farm really and your home.
But it's nice to hear somebody pronouncing it correctly. That's all.
Great. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate that.
But a quick point back to Zach's point that in California, the rage for the big cabs, which I think was the game, versus French and even now the Slovenian, is much more of a subtle cab then, I mean, we wouldn't drink California cabs anymore, I don't think.
Well, it's the trend recently has been to back away from that. So to back away both from that extreme fruit profile and also from the very high alcohol levels. If you're interested in sort of rediscovering California wine, there's a book written by an acquaintance of mine, a guy named John Bonet. A couple of years ago, he wrote a book called The New California, which was very, very well received. And I am going to put a Slovenian bow on this, you'll see. But a lot of the people that he writes about in that book, there are a lot of producer profiles about these folks that are moving towards lower alcohol, brighter, more savory, more sort of agile wines, and also folks that experiment with grapes that you wouldn't necessarily think of as being grown in California. And among the favorite grapes that this sort of new school of California farmers grow is Rebula Gialla from Slovenia. So there are actually a small group of growers that are playing around with Rebula Gialla in Napa Valley. There you go. So my old friend, so two of my friends in California, a guy named Steve Mathiasen and a guy named Abe Schoner, they're both featured prominently in the book. They both grow Rebula Gialla in California. I've known Abe Schoner for almost 20 years now. And the reason I know him is because I was working in an Italian restaurant that featured Rebula Gialla. You know, we had maybe 40 Rebula Gialla on our list. And this guy walks in our restaurant and says, "Hi, I'm Abe. I grow Rebula Gialla in Napa Valley." And we looked at each other and said, "Well, why the hell would you do that?" And he said, "You know what? I'm not really sure, but here they are. I have skin contact Rebula Gialla from California." So my old restaurant was one of his first customers in the U.S. So again, you give me any topic, I can now spin it back to Slovenia. This gentleman's name is Abe Schoner, Schoener, and his winery is called the Scolium Project. What's that?
The name of the book again?
The New California.
Okay. We're sold on Slovenian wines.
Great.
And Zach, you have to keep getting wines from happy plants, I think.
Yep. You can do that.
Robert, you were wonderful tonight.
Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it and appreciate you spending time with us.
What a great overview of Slovenian wines and what a great source of knowledge.
And the geography is extremely helpful.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Zach. Wonderful.
Thank you guys for joining as usual. This, I think, kind of wraps up our little Slovenia 101, maybe even just 100, and we can have Robert back, try some of his other wines.
Great. I'd love to.
Then next week, May 7th, we have a music, wine, and cheese pairing that we're going to be featuring. So that's in about 10 days from now. And then the next Wines Day will be the week after in May. So we're still trying to put that one together. Stay tuned for more fun stuff. Just swing through the co-op and you can see what is on the docket for the next Wines Day. Robert, thank you very much for joining us. And Lynn, as always, thank you for joining. And we will see you at next Wines Day.
Okay.
Thank you, folks. Everyone enjoy their evening.
You're based in Asheville?
I am.
Okay.
But I'm up and down the East Coast.